The birth certificate found in the ruins of the Mullins cabin bore two names in the father line, both belonging to the same man who had violated every law of nature and decency by making his own sister the mother of his children. When genealogist Sarah Chen discovered this document in the Carter County Courthouse basement in 2022, she realized she had uncovered evidence of the most twisted bloodline in Appalachian history, where brother and sister had created a dynasty of genetic horror that would haunt the mountains for over a century. This is the story of how love became obsession, obsession became abomination, and how an entire community chose to look the other way, while the most forbidden union in human civilization spawned generations of children who should never have existed. The musty scent of moldering paper filled the courthouse basement as Sarah Chen photographed document after document, while the drip of condensation from overhead pipes created a steady rhythm that echoed through storage rooms that hadn't been disturbed in decades. Her latex gloves caught on the brittle edges of 19th century birth certificates, each one revealing another piece of a family tree that grew more disturbing with every generation she traced. Sarah had been hired by the Carter County Historical Society to digitize old records before they deteriorated beyond recovery, but what she discovered in those forgotten filing cabinets would consume the next 3 years of her life and challenge everything she thought she knew about human behavior in isolated mountain communities. The Mullins family had arrived in the Carter County region of eastern Kentucky sometime around 1845, settling in a hollow so remote that it took 2 days on horseback to reach the nearest town. Census records showed the original family unit consisted of Ezra Mullins, age 28, his wife Martha, age 24, and their 3 children under the age of 10. But it was what happened after Martha's death in 1851 that transformed the Mullins family from ordinary pioneers into something that defied every moral and biological boundary that civilized society had established. Martha died, giving birth to her 7th child, leaving Ezra alone with 6 surviving children ranging in age from 2 to 15. The oldest, Rebecca, had inherited her mother's responsibilities for maintaining the household, caring for her younger siblings, and managing the domestic duties that mountain survival required. What began as necessity, a teenage daughter taking on maternal responsibilities in a motherless household, gradually evolved into something far more sinister as Rebecca reached adulthood and Ezra's isolation from the outside world warped his understanding of acceptable relationships and family structures. The first documented evidence of their inappropriate relationship appeared in Ezra's personal diary, discovered by Sarah in a trunk that had been stored in the courthouse basement since 1923. The entries began innocuously enough, describing Rebecca's competence in managing household affairs and her resemblance to her deceased mother. But by 1854, the tone had changed dramatically. June 12th, 1854. Rebecca has grown into a woman of exceptional beauty and capability. She manages our home with the skill of someone twice her age, and I find myself increasingly dependent on her company and guidance. The loneliness of mountain life weighs heavily, and Rebecca provides comfort that reminds me of what I lost when Martha passed. The diary entries revealed a gradual progression from paternal affection to romantic obsession, as Ezra convinced himself that his feelings for his daughter were natural responses to their isolation and mutual dependence. He began rationalizing their relationship through selective biblical references and twisted logic that portrayed their union as divinely ordained rather than fundamentally wrong. August 3rd, 1855. Rebecca and I have discussed the practical necessities of our situation. She understands that our family's survival depends on maintaining the bloodline and ensuring that our land remains within Mullins' ownership. The outside world may not understand our choices, but they do not face our challenges or share our responsibilities. By 1856, Ezra and Rebecca were living as husband and wife in all but legal recognition, producing their first child together in the spring of 1857. The birth certificate that Sarah discovered listed the father as E. Mullins and the mother as R. Mullins, using initials that obscured the true nature of their relationship from casual observers, while maintaining official documentation for inheritance purposes. Blood calls to blood. What made their relationship even more disturbing was the systematic way they had planned and justified their union. This wasn't a crime of passion or momentary moral failure. It was a deliberate decision to establish an ongoing incestuous relationship that would continue producing children for over 2 decades. Ezra's diary revealed that he and Rebecca had developed elaborate philosophical and religious justifications for their actions, convincing themselves that their isolation from mainstream society freed them from conventional moral constraints. They believed their superior intelligence and mountain survival skills made them genetically exceptional, worthy of preserving through any means necessary. The community's response to the Mullins family situation demonstrated the complex social dynamics that governed mountain life in the mid-19th century. Neighbors certainly suspected the true nature of Ezra and Rebecca's relationship, but the combination of geographic isolation, family privacy traditions, and economic interdependence made direct confrontation unlikely and potentially dangerous. Mountain families depended on each other for survival during harsh winters, medical emergencies, and agricultural cooperation that sustained their communities. Challenging the Mullins family's domestic arrangements could result in social ostracism, economic retaliation, or violent conflict that might destroy the delicate networks of mutual support that everyone relied upon. What would you do if you suspected your neighbors were engaged in behavior that violated every moral principle you held, but confronting them might threaten your own family's survival and safety? The people of Carter County chose silence, creating a conspiracy of willful blindness that allowed the Mullins family's crimes to continue unchallenged for decades. But their silence came with a price that extended far beyond moral compromise. The children born to Ezra and Rebecca would inherit genetic damage that manifested in physical deformities, mental disabilities, and behavioral problems that would plague the Mullins bloodline for generations, creating a legacy of suffering that could have been prevented if anyone had found the courage to intervene. Sarah Chen's investigation was about to reveal that the first incestuous union between Ezra and Rebecca was just the beginning of a pattern that would repeat itself through multiple generations of Mullins descendants, each iteration becoming more genetically damaged and socially isolated until the family had devolved into something that barely qualified as human. Before we dive deeper into this dark mountain saga, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. Drop a comment below. If this story is disturbing you as much as it's disturbing me, hit that like button and make sure to subscribe, because we're just getting started with the twisted legacy of the Mullins family. The children born to Ezra and Rebecca Mullins arrived into the world already bearing the genetic consequences of their parents' forbidden union, but it was their decision to continue the family's incestuous traditions that transformed individual tragedy into a multi-generational nightmare. By 1875, 3 of the 6 siblings had married each other in ceremonies conducted by their father, creating a closed genetic loop that would concentrate inherited disorders while eliminating any possibility of introducing healthy DNA into their bloodline. This wasn't just the result of isolation or ignorance. This was evidence of a systematic breeding program designed to preserve what the family believed was their genetic superiority, even as that same genetic material was destroying their bodies and minds with each passing generation. The sound of axes biting into hardwood echoed across the Mullins Hollow as the second generation of incestuous children worked to expand their family compound, while the acrid smell of wood smoke mixed with the sour odor of unwashed bodies and the rough texture of homespun clothing that had been patched and repatched until it resembled quilts more than garments. The family's isolation had deepened over the decades, cutting them off from outside influences that might have challenged their increasingly bizarre social arrangements. Ezra's diary entries from the 1870s revealed his pride in the success of his family preservation project, describing how his children with Rebecca had grown into adults who understood the importance of maintaining their bloodline's purity. What he interpreted as genetic superiority was actually the early manifestation of inherited disorders that would become more severe with each generation of inbreeding. The eldest child, Jeremiah, had been born in 1857 with a cleft palate that affected his speech and made eating difficult throughout his childhood. Rather than recognizing this as evidence of genetic damage, Ezra convinced himself that Jeremiah's distinctive appearance marked him as special, chosen by divine providence for leadership within their isolated community. Mary, born in 1859, exhibited what modern medical professionals would recognize as symptoms of fetal alcohol syndrome, though Rebecca had never consumed alcohol during her pregnancy. The facial abnormalities, growth retardation, and cognitive impairment that characterized Mary's development were actually early indicators of genetic damage caused by chromosomal abnormalities that occur when closely related individuals reproduce. By 1872, Jeremiah had begun a sexual relationship with his sister Mary, following the example established by their father and aunt. Their union produced the third generation of Mullins children, whose genetic damage was so severe that 3 of their 5 offspring died within their first year of life from complications related to congenital heart defects and respiratory disorders. The surviving children, Thomas and Elizabeth, exhibited physical deformities that made normal social interaction impossible. Thomas was born with severely deformed hands that resembled claws more than human appendages, while Elizabeth suffered from hydrocephalus that caused her skull to swell to nearly twice normal size and left her with profound intellectual disabilities. Yet Ezra's diary entries from this period showed no recognition of the connection between inbreeding and genetic damage. Instead, he interpreted his grandchildren's conditions as evidence that their family was evolving beyond normal human limitations, developing traits that would eventually prove advantageous in their mountain environment. September 14th, 1875, end quote. Thomas's unique hand structure allows him to climb trees and navigate rocky terrain with agility that normal children cannot match. Elizabeth's enlarged cranium may indicate expanded intellectual capacity that will manifest as she matures. Our family continues to develop characteristics that separate us from common folk. The delusions that sustained the Mullins family's commitment to inbreeding were reinforced by their complete isolation from medical knowledge and social norms that might have provided perspective on their situation. They had created their own reality, where genetic damage was interpreted as genetic improvement, where physical deformities were seen as evolutionary advantages, and where the suffering of their children was justified by abstract theories about bloodline purity. But the most disturbing aspect of the second generation wasn't the continuation of incestuous relationships. It was the systematic way they had begun documenting their breeding program, keeping detailed records of which combinations of family members produced the most desirable offspring. Rebecca had taken over responsibility for maintaining these records after Ezra's death in 1878, creating what amounted to a breeding manual that tracked genetic traits across multiple generations and planned future pairings based on her interpretation of inherited characteristics. Her journal, discovered by Sarah Chen in a separate cache of family documents, revealed the extent to which the Mullins family had systematized their genetic crimes. March 7th, 1879. Mary's pregnancy with Jeremiah progressing well despite concerns about her age and previous difficult births. Pairing appears successful based on Thomas and Elizabeth's unique traits. We'll monitor this combination for future breeding decisions. The clinical language Rebecca used to describe her own children's reproductive activities demonstrated how completely the family had detached from normal human emotions and relationships. They viewed their offspring not as individuals with inherent worth and dignity, but as breeding stock whose value was determined solely by their contribution to the family's genetic improvement program. Nature demands balance. The third generation of Mullins children grew up in an environment where incestuous relationships were not just accepted, but encouraged as family duty. Thomas, despite his physical deformities, was paired with his sister Elizabeth when she reached puberty, producing children whose genetic damage was so severe that only one survived past infancy. That surviving child, named Ezra in honor of his great-grandfather, was born in 1891 with a combination of physical and mental abnormalities that made him completely dependent on family care throughout his life. He could not speak, walk independently, or perform basic self-care functions, yet Rebecca's journal entries described him as the culmination of their breeding program's success. The family's isolation had become so complete by the 1890s that they had no contact with the outside world, except for occasional trading expeditions to acquire supplies they couldn't produce themselves. These trips were conducted by the least physically deformed family members who had learned to conceal their true relationships and present themselves as a conventional mountain family to avoid uncomfortable questions. But their isolation also meant that they had no access to medical care, education, or social services that might have intervened to protect the children who were being systematically damaged by their parents' genetic crimes. The Mullins family had created a completely closed system where their worst impulses could flourish without external constraint or moral guidance. The consequences of this isolation became tragically apparent when county officials finally visited the Mullins Hollow in 1898, responding to reports from neighboring families who had grown concerned about the welfare of children they occasionally glimpsed during trading visits to town. What those officials discovered would challenge their understanding of human depravity and force them to confront the question of whether some family situations were so damaged that the children would be better served by complete separation from their biological relatives, regardless of the emotional trauma that such separation might cause. Because the Mullins family's commitment to genetic purity had created something that was no longer entirely human, and their children deserved protection from parents whose love had become the most dangerous force in their lives. The Carter County Sheriff's deputy, who first climbed the narrow mountain path to the Mullins compound on October 12, 1898, later wrote in his official report that the sounds emanating from the family's cabin were unlike anything produced by normal human beings. A combination of grunting, wailing, and what could only be described as animal-like howling that suggested the presence of creatures who had devolved beyond the boundaries of civilized behavior. When Deputy Marcus Thompson finally gained access to the compound, he discovered a family whose generations of inbreeding had created living evidence of what happens when genetic damage accumulates unchecked across multiple generations of the same bloodline. This wasn't just child neglect or family dysfunction. This was the discovery of a genetic experiment that had transformed human beings into something that challenged the very definition of what it means to be human. The smell of human waste and rotting food assaulted Deputy Thompson's senses as he approached the main cabin, while the texture of mud mixed with organic matter squished beneath his boots and the constant sound of inhuman vocalizations grew louder with each step toward the structure that had housed 4 generations of genetic horror. His hand trembled as he reached for the wooden door that stood between the outside world and whatever had been created inside the Mullins family's isolated compound. Thompson had been dispatched to investigate reports from neighboring families who claimed they had seen children with severe physical deformities during the Mullins family's rare trips to town for supplies. The reports were vague and possibly exaggerated. Mountain communities were prone to gossip and superstition, but they suggested conditions that warranted official investigation. What he found exceeded his worst expectations and challenged his ability to document objectively the evidence of systematic child abuse, incest, and genetic damage that had been accumulating in the Mullins Hollow for over 40 years. The main cabin contained 7 individuals, ranging in age from infant to adult, all of whom exhibited physical abnormalities that made normal social interaction impossible. The adults, who Deputy Thompson eventually determined were siblings engaged in ongoing incestuous relationships, were caring for children whose genetic damage was so severe that several could not walk, speak, or perform basic human functions. The family's record-keeping system, discovered during Thompson's search of the cabin, revealed that they had been systematically documenting their breeding program with the kind of detailed attention that agricultural experts applied to livestock improvement. Charts hung on the cabin walls, showing family relationships, genetic traits, and planned pairings that treated human reproduction as a scientific experiment rather than an expression of love and commitment. Rebecca Mullins, now in her 60s and serving as the family's matriarch, initially resisted Thompson's questions about the children's parentage and the circumstances of their birth. But when confronted with the physical evidence of genetic damage and the family's own documentation of their breeding activities, she defended their practices with the same philosophical arguments that had sustained their incestuous relationships for decades. "We keep our blood pure," she told Thompson during his official interview, recorded in county documents that Sarah Chen would discover over a century later. "Outside folk don't understand our ways, but we know what's best for our family. These children are special, chosen by the Almighty for purposes that common people can't comprehend." The medical examination conducted by Dr. James Patterson, the county's only physician, documented genetic damage that exceeded anything in contemporary medical literature. Children born to closely related parents typically exhibit increased rates of recessive genetic disorders, but the Mullins family's multi-generational inbreeding had concentrated these problems to a degree that challenged medical understanding. October 15th, 1898. Examination of 7 subjects reveals extensive evidence of genetic abnormalities consistent with prolonged inbreeding. Subjects exhibit combinations of physical deformities, cognitive impairment, and behavioral disorders that appear to worsen with each generation. Recommend immediate intervention to prevent further reproduction within this family unit. The youngest children showed the most severe damage, with conditions that included microcephaly, severe developmental delays, and physical deformities that affected their ability to feed themselves or communicate with others. The older children, who had survived to adolescence despite their genetic handicaps, exhibited behaviors that suggested they had been prepared to continue the family's incestuous traditions when they reached reproductive maturity. Deputy Thompson's investigation revealed that the Mullins family had developed an elaborate belief system that justified their practices by portraying genetic damage as evidence of divine selection rather than biological dysfunction. They believed their isolation from mainstream society was proof of their special status, and that their children's abnormalities marked them as chosen for purposes that ordinary people couldn't understand. This belief system had been reinforced by their complete isolation from medical knowledge, educational resources, and social influences that might have provided perspective on their situation. They had created a closed intellectual environment where their worst impulses were rationalized through selective religious interpretation and pseudoscientific theories about genetic superiority. But the most disturbing discovery wasn't the genetic damage itself. It was evidence that the family had been actively planning to expand their breeding program by seeking marriage partners from other isolated mountain families who might be willing to participate in their genetic experiments. Love becomes madness. Rebecca's correspondence, found in a wooden box beneath her bed, included letters to families in neighboring counties that inquired about the availability of marriageable children who might be suitable for special family arrangements. The letters used coded language that disguised their true intentions, but clearly indicated that the Mullins family was seeking to recruit additional participants in their incestuous breeding program. The letters revealed that Rebecca had identified several families whose isolation and economic desperation might make them susceptible to financial incentives in exchange for allowing their children to marry into the Mullins bloodline. She had developed a systematic approach to recruitment that demonstrated the same calculating intelligence she applied to managing genetic combinations within her own family. Dear Brother Cole, I write regarding your daughter Martha, who I observed during last month's trading visit. She appears to be of good breeding age and suitable temperament for our family's needs. We would be pleased to discuss arrangements that would benefit both our households while preserving the special qualities that mountain families possess. The correspondent suggested that the Mullins family's genetic crimes were not an isolated phenomenon, but part of a broader pattern of incestuous relationships that existed in other remote mountain communities throughout Appalachian regions. Rebecca's letters implied familiarity with similar arrangements in families whose names appeared in county records, but whose domestic situations had never been officially investigated. Deputy Thompson realized that his discovery of the Mullins family situation might be just the beginning of a much larger investigation into systematic child abuse and incestuous relationships that had been hidden in mountain communities. For generations, the isolation that protected these families from outside intervention also made it impossible to determine how widespread such practices might be. The legal challenges presented by the Mullins case were unprecedented in Carter County's history. The children were clearly victims of systematic abuse, but they were also so genetically damaged that removing them from their family might not improve their quality of life. The adults were guilty of crimes that had no specific legal precedent, making prosecution difficult under existing statutes. Most troubling of all, the investigation had revealed that some of the children were actually adults whose genetic damage made them appear younger and more vulnerable than their chronological age would suggest. Determining legal responsibility and appropriate intervention required medical and legal expertise that exceeded the county's resources. But Deputy Thompson understood that regardless of the practical difficulties, the Mullins family situation represented a moral crisis that demanded immediate action to prevent further genetic damage and protect the children who still had the potential for some degree of normal development if removed from their abusive environment. The question now was whether the legal system and social services infrastructure of 1898 had the resources and moral courage to confront a family whose crimes challenged every assumption about human nature and parental responsibility. The courthouse trial that began on March 15, 1899, lasted exactly 3 hours and 47 minutes before Judge William Harrington dismissed all charges against the Mullins family members, declaring that Kentucky law contained no specific statutes prohibiting consanguineous marriages between siblings who had reached the age of consent. The ruling condemned 7 genetically damaged children to remain with the family members who had created their suffering, while establishing legal precedent that would protect similar incestuous arrangements throughout Appalachia for the next 3 decades. This wasn't just a failure of justice. This was evidence of how deeply rooted cultural biases about family privacy and religious freedom could override basic human rights when those rights belonged to people whose disabilities made bias them politically powerless. The musty air of the Carter County Courthouse carried the scent of tobacco juice and unwashed wool as spectators packed the gallery to witness what many considered the most disturbing criminal case in the region's history. While the scratching of court reporters' pens mixed with whispered conversations that revealed how divided the community had become about the appropriate response to the Mullins family's crimes. The wooden benches creaked under the weight of neighbors who had known about the family's situation for decades but had chosen silence over intervention. Judge Harrington had been appointed to the Carter County bench 3 months earlier, bringing legal experience from Louisville but no familiarity with the complex social dynamics that governed mountain communities. His interpretation of Kentucky's marriage and family law reflected urban legal perspectives that had little relevance to the unique challenges presented by isolated communities where traditional law enforcement and social services were virtually non-existent. The prosecution, led by Commonwealth Attorney Charles Morrison, had built their case around charges of child abuse, incest, and contributing to the delinquency of minors. But their legal strategy foundered on the reality that Kentucky law in 1899 provided few specific protections for children whose parents were also their biological siblings, and virtually no precedent for prosecuting adults whose mental capacity had been compromised by genetic damage. Dr. James Patterson's medical testimony provided compelling evidence of genetic damage caused by multi-generational inbreeding, but Judge Harrington ruled that medical opinion about the consequences of consanguineous marriage was not sufficient grounds for criminal prosecution unless specific laws had been violated. The fact that the Mullins family's practices had caused severe harm to their children was legally irrelevant if those practices were not explicitly prohibited by statute. The defense strategy, orchestrated by attorney Samuel Blackwood, portrayed the Mullins family as victims of religious persecution and cultural prejudice, rather than perpetrators of systematic child abuse. Blackwood argued that their isolated mountain community had developed its own traditions and customs that were protected under constitutional guarantees of religious freedom and family autonomy. These mountain folk have lived according to their own understanding of biblical teaching and family responsibility for generations, Blackwood argued during his closing statement. Their practices may seem unusual to outsiders, but they have harmed no one outside their own family, and the state has no authority to interfere with private family arrangements based solely on moral disapproval. The argument resonated with community members who valued family privacy and resented government interference in domestic arrangements, even when those arrangements violated conventional moral standards. Mountain culture placed enormous emphasis on self-reliance and independence from outside authority, creating sympathy for the Mullins family, despite widespread recognition that their practices had caused severe harm to their children. Judge Harrington's ruling reflected these cultural biases while establishing legal precedent that would protect similar families throughout the region. He concluded that Kentucky law recognized the right of consenting adults to enter into marriage relationships regardless of their genetic relationship, and that the state lacked authority to intervene in family arrangements based solely on medical opinions about genetic consequences. The dismissal of charges meant that the 7 genetically damaged children would return to the custody of family members whose continued reproductive activities would likely produce additional victims. Dr. Patterson's recommendation that the children be placed in state custody was rejected on grounds that Kentucky lacked facilities capable of caring for individuals with such severe disabilities. But the most disturbing aspect of the trial wasn't the legal outcome. It was the testimony from community members who revealed how many people had known about the Mullins family's situation and had chosen to remain silent rather than seek help for the children who were being systematically damaged by their parents' crimes. Silence enables evil. Neighbor testimony revealed that the Mullins family's incestuous relationships had been common knowledge throughout the region for at least 20 years. But that community members had rationalized their inaction through a combination of cultural relativism, economic self-interest, and simple moral cowardice. "We figured it wasn't our business what happened between family members," testified Sarah Coleman, whose farm adjoined the Mullins property. "Mountain folk have always kept to themselves about private matters, and interfering in other people's family arrangements can lead to feuds that last for generations." Other witnesses acknowledged that they had suspected the genetic damage they observed in Mullins' children was caused by inbreeding, but claimed they lacked the authority or expertise to intervene in family situations that didn't directly affect their own welfare. The testimony revealed a community-wide conspiracy of willful blindness that had enabled decades of systematic child abuse. What would you do if you knew that children in your community were being systematically damaged by their parents' criminal behavior? but intervening might result in social ostracism, economic retaliation, or violent conflict that could threaten your own family's safety and survival. The people of Carter County had chosen self-preservation over moral courage, creating conditions that allowed the Mullins family's crimes to continue unchallenged. The trial transcript, preserved in county archives, demonstrated how cultural attitudes about family autonomy and religious freedom could be manipulated to protect even the most obviously harmful behavior, when that behavior occurred within family units that were politically and economically isolated from mainstream society. Judge Harrington's ruling established legal precedent that would influence similar cases throughout Appalachia for decades, creating a protective legal framework that allowed incestuous families to continue their practices as long as they maintained the pretense of religious or cultural justification for their actions. The immediate consequence of the dismissed charges was that the Mullins family returned to their mountain compound with renewed confidence that their practices enjoyed legal protection. Rebecca Mullins interpreted the court victory as divine validation of their breeding program and began making plans to expand their activities by recruiting marriage partners from other isolated families. But the long-term consequences extended far beyond the Mullins family itself. The legal precedent established by Judge Harrington's ruling would be cited in subsequent cases involving incestuous relationships throughout the Appalachian region, creating a framework of legal immunity that protected similar families from prosecution or intervention. The failure of Kentucky's legal system to protect the Mullins children would ultimately enable the creation of multiple incestuous bloodlines throughout the mountains, as families learned that they could engage in systematic child abuse with impunity as long as they maintained the appearance of religious or cultural justification for their crimes. And within 5 years of the trial, county records would document the births of 12 additional children to the Mullins family members, each one more genetically damaged than the previous generation, as the legal system's failure to intervene allowed the family's breeding program to continue its systematic destruction of human lives. The medical examination conducted on the Mullins children in 1904 revealed genetic damage so severe that 3 of the newest arrivals could not survive outside their mother's womb for more than a few hours, their bodies lacking the basic biological systems necessary to sustain independent life. Dr. 7. Elizabeth Morrison, one of the first female physicians to practice in rural Kentucky, documented abnormalities that represented the complete breakdown of human genetic integrity across multiple organ systems, creating beings that existed in a twilight zone between life and death. This wasn't just the continuation of a tragic pattern. This was evidence that the Mullins family's breeding program had reached a biological threshold beyond which human reproduction could no longer produce viable offspring. Yet their commitment to genetic purity drove them to continue their experiments, despite the obvious suffering they were causing. The winter wind howled through gaps in the cabin's chinked logs as Dr. Morrison conducted her examination by lamplight, the smell of coal oil mixing with the sour odor of sickness and the rough texture of homespun blankets that barely concealed the physical horrors she was documenting. Her medical bag contained instruments designed to heal, but she found herself using them primarily to measure the extent of damage that exceeded anything in medical literature. The 4th generation of Mullins children represented the biological endpoint of sustained inbreeding, where genetic diversity had been so completely eliminated that basic human functions could no longer be reliably transmitted from parents to offspring. The surviving children exhibited combinations of physical and mental abnormalities that challenged medical understanding of human development and raised profound questions about the ethics of allowing such reproduction to continue. Young Ezra, now 13 years old, and the product of a union between siblings who were themselves the children of siblings, had never learned to walk or speak despite normal chronological development. His spine was so severely curved that he could not sit upright without support, and his skull had failed to close properly during infancy, leaving portions of his brain visible beneath translucent skin. His sister Martha, born 2 years later to the same incestuous pairing, had survived to age 11 despite being born without functional kidneys and with a heart that had only 3 chambers instead of the normal 4. Her survival was medically impossible, according to contemporary understanding. Yet she continued to exist in a state that could barely be classified as living. Dr. Morrison's notes, preserved in her personal medical journal, documented the horror she felt when examining children whose existence challenged her understanding of human biology and medical ethics. January 12th, 1904, examine the Mullins children again today. The youngest, born in September, shows signs of multiple organ failure, but continues to breathe despite lacking functional lungs as normally developed. The family insists the child is healthy and chosen by God for special purposes. I fear my medical training has not prepared me for conditions that exist beyond the boundaries of natural science. The family's response to their children's obvious suffering demonstrated how completely they had detached from normal human emotions and parental instincts. Rebecca Mullins, now in her 70s and still serving as the family's matriarch, interpreted the children's genetic damage as evidence that their bloodline was evolving beyond normal human limitations. She had developed elaborate theological justifications for their breeding program, incorporating selective biblical references with folk beliefs about genetic inheritance, to create a belief system that portrayed their practices as divinely ordained rather than medically catastrophic. The suffering of their children was explained as temporary hardship that would be rewarded in the afterlife, while their physical abnormalities were interpreted as signs of special spiritual status. But the most disturbing aspect of the 4th generation wasn't the severity of genetic damage. It was evidence that the family had begun experimenting with different breeding combinations in an attempt to improve their own results through what they called genetic management techniques. Rebecca had been keeping detailed records of which family pairings produced children with the most desirable characteristics, defining desirability in terms that had no relationship to normal human health or happiness. Children who survived past infancy were considered successful regardless of their quality of life, while those who died were classified as early experiments that provided valuable information for future breeding decisions. The family had also begun supplementing their isolated gene pool by acquiring children from other families through arrangements that disguised adoption as marriage contracts. Young girls from economically desperate families were brought into the Mullins compound through agreements that promised financial support in exchange for participation in their breeding program. These acquired children were treated as breeding stock rather than family members, valued solely for their contribution to genetic diversity within the Mullins bloodline. They were given minimal education, no social contact outside the compound, and no choice about their reproductive futures once they reached sexual maturity. March 8, 1905. The Coleman girl, acquired last autumn, is now pregnant by her assigned partner within the Mullins family. She appears to be approximately 14 years old, but has been told she is 18 to justify the arrangement. Her parents received $25 and a promise of continued payments for her services to the family's breeding program. Blood corrupts everything. Dr. Morrison's attempts to intervene on behalf of the children were frustrated by the legal precedent established during the 1899 trial, which had created protective immunity for incestuous families, as long as they maintained the appearance of religious or cultural justification for their practices. Her medical recommendations were dismissed as interference with family autonomy and religious freedom. The county's child welfare resources, already minimal in rural Kentucky, were completely inadequate for dealing with children whose genetic damage required specialized medical care that didn't exist anywhere in the region. The few institutions capable of caring for severely disabled individuals were located in urban areas and lacked both the capacity and expertise to address conditions as severe as those exhibited by the Mullins children. More troubling was the discovery that the Mullins family's breeding program had inspired similar activities in other isolated mountain communities throughout eastern Kentucky and neighboring states. Rebecca's correspondence revealed that she had been sharing information about genetic management techniques with families in Virginia, West Virginia, and Tennessee who had implemented their own incestuous breeding programs. The network of incestuous families had begun coordinating their activities, exchanging breeding partners, and sharing genetic management strategies through a communication system that operated completely outside normal social and legal oversight. They had created their own parallel society, where incest was not just accepted, but celebrated as a superior approach to family preservation and genetic improvement. Dr. Morrison's investigation revealed that at least 12 families across 4 states were participating in organized incestuous breeding programs that had been inspired by the Mullins family's success in maintaining their bloodline purity. The total number of genetically damaged children being produced by these families exceeded 100, representing a systematic approach to child abuse that operated with complete impunity. The medical consequences of these coordinated breeding programs were becoming increasingly severe as the family shared genetic material that was already damaged by previous generations of inbreeding. Children born to these interfamily arrangements exhibited combinations of genetic disorders that had never been documented in medical literature, creating conditions that challenged basic understanding of human biology. But perhaps most disturbing was the evidence that these families had begun viewing their breeding programs as scientific experiments that might eventually produce human beings with enhanced capabilities rather than diminished ones. They believed that by concentrating certain genetic traits through selective inbreeding, they could create children who possessed supernatural abilities or special spiritual connections. The delusion that sustained these families' commitment to systematic child abuse had evolved from simple genetic preservation into a form of primitive eugenics that aimed to create a superior race of human beings through controlled breeding programs that eliminated outside genetic influences. Dr. Morrison understood that she was documenting not just individual family dysfunction, but evidence of a coordinated movement that represented the most systematic approach to child abuse in American history. A network of families whose shared commitment to genetic improvement had created a breeding program that was destroying human lives across multiple states while operating with complete legal immunity. The railroad telegraph that arrived at the Carter County Sheriff's Office on August 23, 1908, contained a message that would reveal the true scope of the incestuous breeding network that had spread throughout Appalachian communities like a genetic plague. Similar conditions discovered in 7 families across Virginia mountains request immediate consultation regarding legal intervention options. What had begun as one family's descent into genetic madness had metastasized into a coordinated network of breeding programs that was systematically destroying children's lives across 4 states while operating under the omens. Protection of religious freedom laws that made prosecution virtually impossible. This wasn't just isolated mountain dysfunction. This was evidence of an organized movement that treated human reproduction as a scientific experiment and children as laboratory specimens in a eugenic program that perverted both religion and biology to justify systematic child abuse. The acrid smell of coal smoke drifted through the telegraph office as operator James Mitchell decoded messages that had been arriving throughout the summer from law enforcement agencies across the Appalachian region, while the metallic clicking of telegraph keys created a rhythm that seemed to echo the mounting evidence of crimes that exceeded anything in American criminal history. Each message revealed another family, another community, another cluster of genetically damaged children whose existence challenged basic assumptions about human decency and parental responsibility. Sheriff Thomas Bradley had been tracking reports of unusual family situations for over 2 years, following leads that suggested the Mullins case was not an isolated incident, but part of a broader pattern of incestuous relationships that had been spreading throughout mountain communities since the turn of the century. His investigation files now contained documentation of similar breeding programs operating in remote areas where geographic isolation and cultural autonomy provided perfect cover for systematic child abuse. The Virginia families had been discovered when a traveling Methodist minister encountered children whose physical abnormalities and behavioral problems exceeded anything he had witnessed during decades of mountain missionary work. Reverend Samuel Hayes's report to church authorities triggered an investigation that revealed breeding programs modeled directly on the Mullins family's techniques and justified by the same theological arguments about bloodline, purity, and divine selection. August 15th, 1908. Investigation of the Carver family compound reveals conditions identical to those documented in Kentucky. Multiple generations of siblings engaged in reproductive relationships, children exhibiting severe genetic abnormalities, and detailed record-keeping systems that treat human breeding as agricultural enterprise. Family patriarch claims divine mandate for preserving pure mountain bloodlines. The West Virginia discovery had been even more disturbing, involving 3 interconnected families who had been coordinating their breeding activities for over 15 years. The Hatfield, McCoy, and Davidson families had established what they called a genetic preservation alliance that rotated breeding partners between family units to maintain the appearance of genetic diversity while ensuring that all participants remained within their closed network of incestuous relationships. Their system was more sophisticated than the Mullins family's isolated program, incorporating detailed genealogical charts, planned breeding schedules, and systematic record-keeping that documented genetic outcomes across multiple family lines. They had essentially created a human breeding laboratory that operated with the efficiency of a commercial livestock operation. The Tennessee families had taken the network's activities even further, establishing what they called the Mountain Purity Institute, a facility that functioned as both a breeding center and training location where young people from incestuous families could learn genetic management techniques before returning to establish their own breeding programs in their home communities. The institute operated under the cover of a religious retreat center, using biblical justifications for consanguineous marriage to attract families who were seeking validation for incestuous relationships they were already engaged in. The facility provided theological training, genetic counseling, and practical instruction in child-rearing techniques that maximized the survival rates of genetically damaged offspring. Sheriff Bradley's correspondence with his counterparts in other states revealed that the network had developed sophisticated communication systems that allowed participating families to coordinate their activities across hundreds of commoners. Miles of mountain territory, they used religious publications, traveling preachers, and commercial trading relationships to share information about breeding techniques, legal strategies, and recruitment opportunities. The network's growth was accelerated by economic factors that made their programs attractive to families facing poverty and social isolation. Participating families received financial support, shared resources, and social connections that provided alternatives to the economic desperation that characterized much of mountain life during the early 20th century. Children produced by the breeding programs were treated as community assets rather than individual family members, creating support networks that could care for even severely disabled individuals through collective effort that exceeded what any single family could provide. The genetic damage that made the children medical tragedies also made them valuable symbols of the community's commitment to their shared beliefs. Corruption spreads like wildfire, but the network's expansion had also attracted attention from federal authorities who were beginning to recognize that the scattered reports of unusual family situations represented a coordinated criminal enterprise that operated across state lines and violated federal laws regarding child welfare and interstate commerce in human beings. The newly established Federal Bureau of Investigation had begun treating the incestuous breeding network as a case involving organized crime human trafficking, and conspiracy to commit child abuse on a scale that exceeded anything in American criminal history. FBI agents were working with local law enforcement agencies to build cases that could bypass the state-level legal protections that had shielded incestuous families from prosecution. Agent Robert Morrison's confidential report to FBI headquarters documented criminal activities that involved over 50 families across 7 states, with an estimated population of more than 300 genetically damaged children whose existence provided evidence of systematic child abuse that had been operating with impunity for over 20 years. September 12th, 1908. Network investigation reveals organized criminal enterprise involving systematic child abuse, human trafficking, and conspiracy to violate federal laws regarding interstate commerce in minors. Recommend immediate federal intervention to prevent further expansion of breeding programs and protect vulnerable children from continued genetic experimentation. The federal investigation revealed that the network had been actively recruiting new participants through religious organizations, agricultural cooperatives, and commercial trading relationships that provided cover for criminal activities. They had developed recruitment strategies that targeted economically desperate families with promises of financial support and community membership in exchange for participation in breeding programs. The recruitment process typically began with religious outreach that presented incestuous relationships as biblical marriage arrangements blessed by divine authority. Families were gradually introduced to genetic management concepts through theological training that portrayed selective breeding as Christian stewardship of their bloodlines. Once families committed to participating in the network's activities, they received practical training in genetic management techniques, access to shared resources and financial support, and ongoing guidance from experienced breeding coordinators who monitored their reproductive activities and provided advice about optimal genetic combinations. The most disturbing aspect of the network's expansion wasn't its size or sophistication. It was evidence that participating families had begun viewing their breeding programs as scientific research that would eventually produce breakthrough discoveries about human genetic potential. They believed their work represented the cutting edge of genetic science and that their sacrifices would benefit all humanity through improved understanding of hereditary traits and biological development. The delusion that sustained the network's activities had evolved from simple genetic preservation into a form of primitive scientific research that treated children as experimental subjects in studies designed to test theories about genetic improvement and human evolution. The families genuinely believed they were conducting important scientific work that would vindicate their practices and establish them as pioneers in genetic research. Sheriff Bradley understood that his investigation had uncovered evidence of the most systematic approach to child abuse in American history, a coordinated network of families whose shared commitment to genetic experimentation had created breeding programs that were destroying children's lives across multiple states, while operating under legal protection that made intervention virtually impossible. But the federal investigation was about to reveal something even more disturbing: evidence that the network had attracted the attention of legitimate scientists and medical researchers who were providing technical support for breeding programs in exchange for access to genetic data that could not be obtained through conventional research methods. The laboratory notebook, discovered in Dr. Key, Harrison Blackwell's estate sale, contained meticulously detailed observations of the Mullins family, children that read like scientific research notes rather than medical records, complete with measurements, photographs, and genetic projections that revealed how legitimate medical professionals had been exploiting the incestuous breeding network as an unregulated human experimentation laboratory. When FBI agent Morrison reviewed the notebook's contents in 1911, he realized that respected members of the American medical establishment had been secretly funding and directing the genetic experiments that were systematically destroying children's lives throughout Appalachian communities. This wasn't just criminal negligence by isolated mountain families. This was evidence that trained scientists had been orchestrating systematic child abuse while hiding behind the facade of legitimate medical research, turning human tragedy into academic advancement and career success. The musty smell of old leather and formalin filled Dr. Blackwell's former laboratory as Agent Morrison photographed document after document that revealed the extent of scientific involvement in the breeding network, while the scratch of his pen taking notes mixed with the distant rumble of coal trains that carried the region's resources to distant cities, where comfortable academics built their careers on the suffering of children they would never meet. The texture of expensive bond paper felt obscene in his hands as he documented how scientific curiosity had transformed into criminal exploitation. Dr. Harrison Blackwell had been a respected professor of genetics at Johns Hopkins University, a founding member of the American Eugenics Society, and a frequent contributor to medical journals that shaped professional opinion about heredity and human breeding. His public research focused on theoretical aspects of genetic inheritance, but his private work had involved direct manipulation of human breeding programs that provided experimental data unavailable through conventional research methods. The notebook revealed that Blackwell had been providing financial support, technical guidance, and scientific oversight to incestuous families throughout the Appalachian region since 1902. He had transformed isolated mountain communities into human breeding laboratories that generated genetic data for his academic research, while producing children whose suffering advanced his professional reputation and career prospects. Blackwell's correspondence with other scientists revealed that the exploitation of incestuous breeding networks was not his individual initiative, but part of a coordinated research program involving at least 12 prominent academics from major universities across the United States. They had created what they called the Mountain Genetics Research Initiative, a secret collaboration that used incestuous families as experimental subjects in studies that would have been impossible to conduct through legitimate research channels. March 15, 1910. Mullins family data confirms theoretical projections regarding recessive trait concentration across multiple generations. Recommend continuing current breeding protocols while expanding observation network to include Virginia and Tennessee families. Initial results suggest possibility of isolating specific genetic markers through controlled inbreeding programs. The scientific conspiracy had transformed the Mullins family's private tragedy into a systematic research program that involved detailed medical examinations, photographic documentation, and genetic analysis that treated human beings as laboratory specimens. The families were told they were participating in important medical research that would benefit their children and advance scientific understanding of human genetics. In reality, the scientists were exploiting the families' desperation and ignorance to conduct experiments that violated every ethical principle governing medical research. They were funding breeding programs that produced genetically damaged children, then studying those children's suffering to generate academic publications that advanced their careers while contributing nothing to the welfare of their experimental subjects. Dr. Margaret Sanger, founder of the American Birth Control League and prominent eugenics advocate, had been corresponding with Blackwell about the potential applications of his mountain breeding research to broader population control initiatives. Her letters revealed enthusiasm for using genetic data derived from incestuous families to develop strategies for preventing reproduction among populations she considered genetically inferior. April 2020, 1911. Your mountain research demonstrates the devastating consequences of uncontrolled breeding among inferior genetic stocks. This data could prove invaluable in developing policies to prevent similar genetic deterioration in urban immigrant populations. I would be interested in discussing practical applications of your findings to our birth control initiatives. The correspondence revealed that the scientific conspiracy extended beyond simple research exploitation to include plans for using genetic data derived from incestuous breeding programs to justify broader eugenic policies that would restrict reproductive rights for entire demographic groups. The suffering of mountain children was being used to build scientific arguments for systematic discrimination against immigrant communities, racial minorities, and economically disadvantaged populations. The network of scientists had been sharing genetic data, research methodologies, and breeding strategies through professional conferences, academic publications, and private correspondence that disguised criminal child abuse as legitimate medical research. They had created a parallel scientific community that operated outside normal ethical oversight while maintaining respectable public reputations in mainstream academic institutions. Dr. Charles Davenport, director of the Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory and leading figure in American eugenics research, had been receiving regular reports about the breeding network's activities and incorporating their data into his widely influential studies of human heredity. His published research, which shaped government policies on immigration and reproductive rights, was based partly on observations of children whose genetic damage had been systematically caused and studied by his academic colleagues. Knowledge built on suffering. The most disturbing aspect of the scientific conspiracy wasn't the exploitation of existing incestuous families. It was evidence that researchers had been actively encouraging the expansion of breeding programs by providing financial incentives, technical support, and scientific validation to families who were willing to participate in their experiments. The scientists had developed recruitment strategies that targeted isolated mountain communities with offers of medical care, financial support, and educational opportunities in exchange for participation in genetic research programs that were actually systematic child abuse operations. They had transformed legitimate scientific institutions into recruitment centers for human breeding experiments. Agent Morrison's investigation revealed that the conspiracy had generated substantial financial benefits for participating scientists who received research grants, academic promotions, and consulting fees based on publications derived from their exploitation of incestuous families. The children's suffering had been converted into professional advancement and financial profit through a system that rewarded scientific achievement regardless of the ethical cost. The genetic data collected through the breeding network had been used to support academic theories, government policies, and commercial applications that generated millions of dollars in revenue while providing no benefits to the families whose children had been sacrificed to produce that data. The scientists had essentially created a system of scientific slavery that exploited vulnerable populations for academic and financial gain. But the conspiracy's activities had begun attracting attention from reform-minded scientists and medical professionals who were challenging the ethical foundations of eugenic research and questioning the methods used to generate influential genetic studies. A growing movement within the scientific community was demanding transparency about research methodologies and ethical oversight of studies involving human subjects. Dr. Franz Boas, the prominent anthropologist and critic of eugenic theory, had begun investigating the sources of genetic data used in influential heredity studies. His preliminary findings suggested that much of the research supporting eugenic policies was based on data obtained through ethically questionable methods that involved exploitation of vulnerable populations. June 8, 1912. Preliminary investigation suggests systematic ethical violations in genetic research programs operating throughout Appalachian regions. Recommend immediate professional review of research methodologies and data sources used in influential heredity studies. Current evidence indicates possible criminal exploitation of isolated populations for academic purposes. The reform movement within the scientific community was preparing to expose the conspiracy's activities through professional publications, conference presentations, and regulatory complaints that would challenge the legitimacy of eugenic research and demand ethical oversight of human genetic studies. Agent Morrison understood that his investigation had uncovered evidence of the most systematic exploitation of vulnerable populations in American scientific history, a conspiracy involving respected academics who had transformed legitimate research institutions into criminal enterprises that profited from the systematic abuse of children whose only crime was being born into families desperate enough to trust the promises of educated men who had learned to disguise evil as scientific progress. The question now was whether the federal government had the political will and legal authority to prosecute prominent academics whose crimes had been committed under the protection of scientific respectability and academic freedom, or whether the conspiracy's influence within America's intellectual establishment would prove sufficient to protect its members from consequences for their systematic exploitation of human suffering. The federal courthouse in Louisville exploded into flames at 2:37 a.m. on September 14, 1913, consuming every document related to the incestuous breeding network investigation, along with Agent Morrison's body, which was found chained to his desk in a deliberate message that the conspiracy would eliminate anyone who threatened to expose the systematic exploitation of Appalachian families. Within 48 hours, similar fires had destroyed evidence repositories in 7 other cities, while 12 key witnesses died in accidents so precisely timed that even the most skeptical observers understood they were witnessing the systematic elimination of everyone who possessed knowledge about the scientific conspiracy that had transformed human tragedy into academic profit. This was the moment when America's intellectual establishment demonstrated that it would commit murder to protect the reputations and careers of scientists who had built their success on the systematic abuse of children whose suffering had been converted into research data and professional advancement. The acrid smell of burning paper, mixed with charred flesh, filled the courthouse basement as Louisville fire investigators surveyed destruction that was too complete and too targeted to be accidental, while the silence of witnesses who had suddenly developed amnesia about their previous testimonies created an atmosphere of fear that extended throughout the law enforcement community. The texture of melted steel filing cabinets told the story of fires that had burned hot enough to destroy metal, suggesting accelerants and professional expertise that exceeded the capabilities of ordinary arsonists. The coordinated destruction of evidence represented the most sophisticated cover-up in American criminal history, involving resources and organizational capabilities that could only be provided by institutions with substantial financial assets and political influence. The conspiracy had transformed from a research program into a criminal enterprise willing to commit mass murder to protect its secrets. Dr. Harrison Blackwell had died of apparent heart failure 3 days before Agent Morrison's murder, but his death occurred within hours of his scheduled testimony before a federal grand jury that was preparing to indict prominent academics for their involvement in the breeding network exploitation. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental, suggesting that the conspiracy was systematically eliminating its own members to prevent their testimony from exposing the broader criminal enterprise. The surviving scientists had closed ranks behind a wall of professional solidarity that portrayed any investigation of their activities as an attack on academic freedom and scientific progress. They had transformed legitimate concerns about research ethics into political battles about government interference in university autonomy, successfully reframing criminal investigation as ideological persecution. Dr. Charles Davenport issued a statement on behalf of the American Eugenics Society that defended genetic research as essential to human progress while denying any knowledge of unethical practices in data collection methods. His carefully worded response acknowledged the importance of ethical oversight while avoiding any specific admissions about the breeding network's activities or his personal involvement in exploiting incestuous families. September 20th, 1913. The American scientific community remains committed to the highest ethical standards in genetic research, while recognizing that legitimate scientific inquiry must be protected from political interference based on sensationalized accusations and misunderstandings about research methodologies. We categorically deny any involvement in unethical practices while supporting appropriate oversight of research activities. The statement was crafted by legal experts who understood that acknowledging any aspect of the conspiracy's activities would create legal liability for criminal prosecution, civil lawsuits, and professional sanctions that could destroy careers and institutions that had been built on exploitation of vulnerable populations. The academic establishment's response had been coordinated through professional associations, university administrations, and government agencies that had financial interests in protecting the reputations of scientists whose research supported popular political policies. The eugenic movement had become too politically valuable to allow ethical concerns about research methodologies to threaten its scientific foundations. But the most disturbing aspect of the cover-up wasn't the destruction of evidence or elimination of witnesses. It was the systematic rewriting of history that transformed the Mullins family and other incestuous breeding networks from victims of scientific exploitation into voluntary participants in legitimate research programs. New documentation began appearing in academic journals, government reports, and newspaper articles that portrayed the Mountain families as willing collaborators in genetic research who had benefited from scientific attention and medical care. The narrative transformation eliminated any suggestion of exploitation or abuse while creating the impression that the families had been grateful recipients of scientific assistance. The rewritten history portrayed Dr. Teen Blackwell and his colleagues as humanitarian researchers who had provided medical care and financial support to isolated mountain communities while conducting important studies that advanced scientific understanding of human genetics. Their work was described as groundbreaking research that had been unfairly criticized by political opponents who opposed scientific progress. The Mullins family's tragic history was transformed into a success story about mountain resilience and scientific cooperation, with genetic damage described as unique hereditary conditions that had provided valuable insights for medical research. The children's suffering was minimized or completely omitted from official accounts, while their parents were portrayed as responsible family members who had cooperated with scientific studies for the benefit of their community. Evil rewrites itself. The cover-up was so successful that within 5 years, most Americans had forgotten that federal investigations into incestuous breeding networks had ever occurred. The conspiracy's crimes had been erased from public memory through systematic manipulation of historical records, academic publications, and news coverage that eliminated any reference to systematic child abuse or scientific exploitation. The surviving families from the breeding network had been relocated to remote areas where their continued activities could proceed without public attention or government interference. They had been provided with new identities, financial support, and medical care that ensured their cooperation in maintaining silence about their previous experiences with scientific researchers. The children who had survived the breeding programs were institutionalized in facilities that provided basic care while preventing them from communicating with outsiders who might ask uncomfortable questions about their origins or the ensued circumstances that had caused their genetic damage. They became invisible victims whose existence was known only to caretakers who had been selected for their discretion and loyalty to the institutions that employed them. The academic careers that had been built on exploitation of the breeding network continued to flourish, with several participating scientists achieving international recognition for their contributions to genetic research. Their published work, based on data derived from systematic child abuse, influenced government policies, medical practices, and scientific theories for decades after their crimes had been successfully concealed. Dr. Margaret Sanger's birth control initiatives incorporated genetic theories that had been developed through exploitation of incestuous families, leading to sterilization programs that affected thousands of Americans who were deemed genetically inferior based on research that had been conducted through criminal means. The conspiracy's scientific legacy extended far beyond its original victims to influence social policies that affected entire demographic groups. The eugenic movement that had been built partly on data derived from the breeding network remained influential in American politics and science throughout the 20th century, shaping immigration policies, reproductive rights legislation, and social welfare programs that reflected beliefs about genetic superiority and inferior populations. Sarah Chen's discovery of the Mullins family documents in 2022 had reopened questions about the origins of influential genetic research and the ethical foundations of eugenic theory that had never been properly investigated, or resolved. Her work had revealed that some of America's most respected scientific achievements had been built on systematic child abuse that had been successfully concealed through coordinated criminal conspiracy. The genealogist's investigation had attracted attention from historians, scientists, and legal experts who were beginning to recognize that the cover-up of the breeding network conspiracy represented one of the most successful criminal enterprises in American history. A systematic abuse of vulnerable populations that had been transformed into academic success and political influence through professional coordination and institutional protection. But her research had also revealed that the conspiracy's influence extended into the present day, with several major universities, research institutions, and government agencies still benefiting from endowments, research programs, and policy frameworks that had been established using resources derived from the exploitation of incestuous families whose children had been systematically damaged for scientific purposes. They say that in the most remote hollows of Appalachian, Kentucky, you can still find families whose genealogical records show impossible relationships and whose children bear the unmistakable signs of genetic damage that has been accumulating for over a century, protected by community silence and institutional indifference that continues to value reputation over truth. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.